Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China has expanded export controls on rare earth elements, a move aimed at refining its export control system, and according to many observers, responding to a series of U.S. coercive measures seen as violations of the Madrid Agreement. In response, U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened sweeping 100% tariffs on Chinese goods and new export restrictions on critical software. So why does Washington continue to impose punitive measures on China despite Madrid Agreement, which commits both sides to avoid further provocations? What does China's tightening of rare earth exports mean for U.S. industries? And beyond rare earth, as the U.S. imposes new fees on Chinese vessels and Beijing prepares to respond in kind, are we witnessing the start of another round of a trade war between the world's two largest economies? Join us for discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor John Goon from the University of International Business and Economics, Saurabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies, Radhika Desai, Director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, and Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. Welcome to Dialogue. Well, John, I'll start with you. As we all know, China recently expanded the export control on rare earth elements. According to the Chinese, official documents, it aims to refine its export control system. It's not a ban of rare earth export. It also mentioned about its, a responsibility for defend world peace and regional stability, fulfill non-proliferation and other international obligations. I think that refers to China will not allow the use of rare earth for the production of, say, weapons. The move comes as both sides try to revive trade talks. But Beijing also remains frustrated by the latest round of U.S. tech restrictions. So from your perspective, how do you look at these moves by Beijing?
Well, first of all, I think this policy tool is essentially learned from the United States. I think this is something the U.S. has introduced in the realm of export control. This is what's described as the long-arm administration or long-arm jurisdiction of its exported products, and China is barely mirroring the practice in Washington, D.C. And there's a context behind this. The context is that after both sides have reached an agreement in Madrid, now all of a sudden there have been a series of policy measures targeting China, including imposing fees on ships built by China docking at the United States, including putting more companies on entity lists, including measures about restricting semiconductor chips related to AI. All these things are not in China's interest, and after the fact that we have reached an agreement on a TikTok matter, which obviously shows that China is actually doing the Trump administration a big favor. Now, of course, they turn around and impose these things, and I think Beijing has had enough and decided to respond. I think it also reflects probably some kind of a disconnect or division within the Trump administration. I think from what USTR Jamison Greer has said, and also from what the Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent has said, it seems to me that what this whole matter, which mostly coming from the Department of Commerce, from Secretary of Commerce Lutnick, it's not in coherence, in my view, within the Trump administration. There's a disagreement. Apparently, there's a disagreement between these two sides. And I think, from China's perspective, we don't want to be treated like this, and is forced to respond. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the history of the trade spat between the United States and China, at every turn of event, it's always Washington unilaterally initiate something first, and Beijing was forced to respond in kind.
Right. Speak of that, Mr. Gupta. According to the Chinese government, since trade talks in Madrid in September, the U.S. in just 20 days has introduced a string of new restrictive measures targeting China. It has put multiple Chinese entities on the entity list and a special designated national list, arbitrarily expanded the scope of control over businesses with affiliates rule that affects thousands of Chinese companies. That's the so-called 50% rule, and persistent with the implementation of Section 301 measures targeting China's maritime, logistic, and shipbuilding industries in disregard of China's concerns and goodwill. So tell us, how do you look at that? You think there's some people say there's a misunderstanding. Is that the case? What went wrong here?
Wrong out here is that, yes, there is some element of disconnect out here. You are correct. The specific issue out here is that 50% rule, the subsidiaries rule. And just like they have, where the Treasury Department has the special designated nationals list. Now we have to look at it this way. The Americans think that what they are doing is just streamlining their export controls. This was to tackle issues like diversion, etc., etc. And they're playing a whack-a-mole game and trying to figure out entities which should be in the list, but then manage to evade it. And so they have kind of streamlined it and regularized their export controls. That's what the Americans would say. The Chinese would shoot back and say that what they have done in with their current rare earths regulation is also to an extent streamlined their regulation. They've borrowed a lot of things from US export controls, like the foreign direct product rule, the de minimis rule, the 50% rule, again, also in that framework. So this is really not implementing new measures per se, although it does pull in entities within those lists. But it's more like a streamlining of these things. So both sides are suggesting that they're not implementing new controls per se, as long as regularizing and streamlining those controls. I think where things have gone wrong a little bit is the US side has to understand that it needs to give to it, not just take. China has come in and made a compromise on the TikTok issue. China has shown a willingness to buy a huge amount of Boeing aircraft, willingness to purchase huge amount of soybeans, but the US needs to be ready to deal too. What is the US coming to the table with? And if the US doesn't come to the table with something but is expecting more and more and more, while we have these export controls, whether they're being streamlined or extended, it will queer the pitch and make things harder. And that's where the thing is. So I would not over exaggerate what has happened in the last 15 days. I think this is all part of the maneuvering that's happening within the negotiation. It is just pushing back issues which will now have to be dealt with over the next 6 months, rather than could be dealt with in the next 3 weeks. But we have to understand that both sides are approaching it in that way. And I think the US needs to be a little bit more alert to giving a little bit more and compromising a little bit in the context of a larger comprehensive agreement than just taking.
Yes, let me bring in Radhika. Radhika, if you look at the U.S., whatever they have been doing, or streamlining or harmonizing of their, let's say, export control measures. But what happened is, like, for example, the Dutch seized the Chinese company Nexperia, a subsidiary of a Chinese company, with the U.S. ultimatum. I mean, that's one of the thousands of Chinese companies that could be closed because of the US actions. That's an attack on the Chinese high-tech companies. No country will accept that. And then, you cannot say this is the environment we can continue to talk to each other. So the Chinese side was forced to respond, can we say so?
I think that this has been, I agree with what John Gong and Saurav Gupta have said. I think that this is just a new chapter in this kind of a very theatrical trade war that the US has been waging against China. And I think what the US tries to do is basically it tries to essentially, remember, this is part of the theatrics for the US electorate. So the United States has to look as though it's putting a lot of pressure on China and so on. But of course, every time it exceeds a certain line, when stock markets get jittery or certain important interests don't like it, then of course Trump backtracks. This is the whole taco business. So I think that both sides are essentially positioning themselves, particularly Trump is engaged in these theatrics, and to some extent he's positioning himself for the upcoming meeting between Presidents Xi and Trump, which he has now been accepted is going to go ahead. And we will see what happens, because so far Trump has continued to postpone the trade deal that's supposed to take place. There's only one small matter on which I would demur. I think that with what people have said before, I think that what people have said before assumes that at some point the United States is interested in coming up with a trade deal. And while at some point this is so, I think that this is not the only objective. The other main objective of the US administration is to make it look as though the United States is acting in the interest of US industry, US workers, etc., very much with the electoral cycle in mind, with President Trump's support in mind, and so on. So this is an important other element in the situation.
Ms. Warwick, how do you look at the U.S. response? First of all, there's a long post by Trump. He reacted, in an angry way. We can see, he's shocked, he's angry. And then we have J.D. Vance, speaking on TV, talking about being reasonable. And recently we have the Secretary of Treasury, Bessent, talked about, China is hurting, bringing everybody down, hurting the global economy. He's not talking about tariffs on, U.S. imposed on everybody else. And he said, this is a sign of, the export controls are a sign of how weak the Chinese economy is. What's your interpretation?
Yeah, it's a bunch of bloviating baloney, actually, from Bessent and the rest of them. The fact of the matter is that the United States has once again demonstrated that it's a bad faith actor. It's demonstrated that in other contexts where it's lured people to so-called peace negotiations only to provide coordinates to enable bombs to be dropped on them. And metaphorically speaking, this is another classic example where they agree one thing and then proceed to do something else. So first thing to note is that the United States has proven once again that it is an entitled bad faith actor. Secondly, the reaction that we saw within hours of the announcement of the export regulations convinces me that the United States has got a deep and wide soft underbelly. The fact that the United States responded with such anger and venom to the announcement of what is in effect a series of licensing measures tells us that it is very concerned that its use of rare earth elements and other materials, such as those that go into batteries, is used in a way that is actually unacceptable globally. And by that I mean using these materials to make weapons of war. Now, China made it very, very clear that the first thing is its own national security. It's not going to supply the raw materials to somebody who runs around the world telling everybody that China's an adversary, deploying bombs and weapons and missiles around China's periphery. It's not going to do that, right? You'd have to be crazy. You'd have to have rocks in your head to do that. The second thing, though, and just as importantly, China's actually sending a message to the world that legitimate civilian and humanitarian uses of these materials and technologies will be perfectly fine, but China will no longer stand by the use and abuse of these technologies and materials for weapons of war. That's what I think we get out of this. The United States does not like the fact that its military-industrial complex and its principal tools of global domination are now being strangled by somebody who says enough is enough.
Well said. John, here, if you look at the Chinese side, China stressed that the U.S. Commerce Control List, CCL, covers over 300 items, whereas China's export control list of dual-use items only cover about 900. But, they act in a way very similar, but somehow the U.S. is shocked, the U.S. is angry with what China is doing. Why?
Well, I think it reflects the habitual sentiment, habitual attitude on the part of the United States government in dealing with foreign countries. I mean, they've been dealing with foreign countries like this for the last, 70, 80 years. It's always been like that. They act sort of arrogantly, pompously, and they do whatever they want and don't expect the other party to respond in kind. Now, China is not a country like this. It's not some small little crappy country that you can throw against the wall. The world has really changed. It's no longer a unipolar world anymore. And I think in dealing with China, these American politicians, these government officials in Washington, in White House, have to understand they have to bring another kind of attitude to the negotiating table. They can't do things like this, and they're going to find out this in this process, that they're going to learn by doing things. They're going to learn that the old way of doing things, dealing with other countries is not going to work here with China. We are one of the two greatest powers in the world right now, and the way they
it's like equality and a mutual respect.
You have to negotiate. You have to talk on equal terms, and you don't expect throw out a set of unilateral matters on China and on responding by the other government, by Chinese government, it acted as if it's an innocent party and be surprised about it. Why should Trump be surprised about it? Unless he doesn't know about it, and that means a huge problem within the Trump administration.
Right, let him be on the receiving end.
Yeah, Leonard is doing something he doesn't even know about it. I just don't believe it. So I think Washington is going to learn about this, and they're going to change. I think moving forward, they have to bring an entirely different set of attitude and sentiment to the table.
A different mindset.
A different mindset, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Mr. Gupta, President Trump threatened a blanket 100% tariff on all Chinese goods. Will that become real at the beginning of next month?
No, I don't expect that to even come through. And the one thing that did strike me was Trump went off his rocker the minute very, very soon after the export control regulation was put out. I wonder, he must have had some degree of briefing, but he didn't probably have a detailed briefing, and he just, as I said, went off his rocker. And then when calmer times came and he got a more thorough briefing of what the measures are, it registered to him at that point of time that, okay, the Chinese have strong tools, but this is not about actual implementation of very stringent export controls right away. As I said, more about streamlining. And at that point of time, it registered to him that, oh, maybe it's not as bad at this point of time, and it has not scuppered all negotiations with the Chinese. So what we are talking in terms of Americans just going, the conversation we're having in not having mutual respect, etc., it could well be the case that, Trump just shoots his mouth off right away without knowing the full substance of the matter. And now he knows the full substance of the matter, and everybody's calming down a little bit, because they should, because that's what this export control rule is about, frankly. And therefore, I do not expect additional tariffs to kick in, because if additional tariffs kick in, that would be a very, very negative deed in the context of the rounds of US-China negotiations that have taken place. And of course, that will be essentially a total embargo on trade by both sides.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's right. Mr. Warwick, if you look at, of course, the two countries are basically levying additional fees on the vessels, and China has targeting the 5 U.S. subsidiaries of South Korean shipbuilder Hua Ocean, and of course the U.S. is imposing fees on the Chinese side. Are we seeing this new round of a trade war? And if that's the case, I mean, which country is in the better position probably to handle that? Or how will we end this?
Well, there's two ways I think we could look at this. The first way is to look on the bright side, and that is that there are more and more things on the table that can then be taken off the table as part of negotiations. So that's the glass half full view of the world. The glass half empty view of the world, however, suggests that in fact what we're dealing with are deep structural problems that are not going to be easily resolved through these sorts of transactional negotiations. The deep structural problems go to the fact that the United States has a view that it needs to rebuild an industry or an industrial sector that for the past 70 years it has slowly let go. And it blames China for the fact that it has deindustrialized. It can't look internally at the reasons why the expansion of finance capital and the explosion of financialization has actually gutted American industry and American manufacturing communities over the last 5 decades. And so it needs to find an external enemy. Because of that, it has set its sights on China. And until it resolves these issues, or as I often say, until America actually comes to peace with itself, it's never going to be at peace with the rest of the world. This situation is ultimately going to be resolved in a structural sense. And the structural reality is that the United States simply does not have the material wherewithal to sustain the kind of economy that it wishes it has. And it certainly doesn't have the capacity to deliver the living standards that Americans have been promised. The United States working families, the 50% or so below the average, have been going backwards for the last 40 years. That's not going to improve. And until these issues essentially unfold over the next so many years, the United States political class will always be looking to blame someone else for its own inability to tackle its own structural problems and chronic imbalances.
Well, we talked about the rare earth elements, export control, of course, and then the shipbuilding industry, and then economies. Radica, if you look at the latest number on the Chinese side, for example, the August-September trade data, that shows a stronger than expected export growth. Exports rose by 4.4% year on year in August, and then increased significantly by 8.3% year on year in September. This is against the background of China's export to the U.S. actually slided by 27%. What does it say about the trade ties between the two countries?
Well, I think what it says is that, well, the trade ties are fraying for all the reasons that we have been investigating. And I think that the effect of the fraying of trade ties will be worse for the United States than it will be for China. These trade statistics that came out recently underline that. Because although the thing is, every time the Trump administration postpones this, the imposition of higher tariffs, the taco factor, what happens, in fact, is that there's usually a surge of imports into the United States because people are trying to import things before the big tariffs hit. But what these trade statistics show is that actually China has not necessarily benefited primarily from that. What China has benefited from is the fact that its trade with the rest of the world is expanding, and this is what has made China's trade statistics, trade performance improve so radically. Everybody would have expected, particularly given the impression people have that China is uniquely dependent on the United States, that China's trade would have been devastated by these measures and by the general atmosphere of uncertainty and by the tariffs that have already been imposed. But this has not been the case. So what this shows us is, again, that, for reasons that I've said, Trump's actions are performative, and Warwick just said very, very well why these performative actions have to take place, because of the underlying problems of deindustrialization, working class dissatisfaction, electorate dissatisfaction, etc. But in this war, what the United States is doing primarily is creating a climate of uncertainty. In a certain sense, it doesn't even matter whether Trump and Xi come up with some kind of agreement when they meet in Korea in the coming days, because the damage has already been done. The entire world is going to reorient away from the United States because they know that even a deal is not worth the paper it's written on that you make with the United States, for the reasons that Warwick just laid out and I've laid out in previous programs. So the point we have is that China is playing this game with a stronger hand. It is also, somebody mentioned the fact that different parts of the administration are often pulling in different directions as far as the US is concerned. In China, that is not the case. There is a certain overall understanding. And let me add one other thing, which is that, as far as creating a more predictable, a more rules-based international order, which is the phrase that the Americans like to use, but of course they smash the rules at every opportunity. But I think China is trying to do so, and its latest move has been quite interesting. It has basically said that it is no longer going to claim developing country status within the WTO. This is a major move in support of a more a reliable, viable trade agreement. So I think what we are going to look at going forward is that more and more the rest of the world will move forward by creating this kind of reliable trading arrangements. Meanwhile, the United States, which for its own internal reasons is compelled to act in this irresponsible, unreliable, unpredictable way, will largely be left out of trade and economic relations in the world.
Well, with that in mind, John, both China and the U.S. confirmed that there's a low-level, working-level talks on Monday between the two sides. Of course, ultimately it's up to the senior-level discussions and even the two leaders to engage with each other. But, in the near future, to expect any solid progress or, concessions from neither side or compromise from any side, so we can stabilize a little bit the ties here?
Well, I can imagine the atmosphere in the room when both sides come into the room for a dialogue. I have a lot of sympathy for the officials going into these dialogues. With this kind of atmosphere, it's very difficult to be engaged in a meaningful conversation. I think most likely just both sides going to say something that express their own position, which are miles apart, and just agree to disagree, I guess. So I don't see any prospect of making significant and substantial progress in those levels of dialogues. They might be able to solve some sort of concrete issues here and there, but in the grand scheme of things, the bigger issue will have to be worked out. Frankly, it will be worked out by the top leaders of the two countries. I still expect that there's going to be some real outcome coming out of the President Xi and President Trump's meeting. I think one thing is very important. Right now, between the two countries, there's absolutely no trust among government officials between the two governments. But at least I think there is some trust between the two leaders here, and they still be engaged in a friendly conversation. I hope that this level of trust and this level of friendship is not going to be damaged because of the actions by Secretary of Commerce Lutnick and other government officials from Washington. I hope that there's still some friendly and constructive conversation going on in a few weeks in Seoul.
Yeah, Mr. Gupta, Secretary Bessent talked about enlisting India and other Western countries to support the U.S. In their talks with China. How likely is that?
Oh, no. These are all going on bilateral tracks. It is the United States which has been going on a bilateral track, trying to pin countries down to get the best deals. So now all of a sudden it can't be turning around and saying, oh, why don't you put pressure on this one and that one? We've seen in the case, even in terms of the Russia sanctions, they've been trying to put pressure on India and have tariffs on India to make their moves against Russia. It's not happening. So I don't foresee that as a serious proposition per se.
Any expectation in the directed talks between the two sides? Briefly.
Oh, yes. Is that? Oh, I'm sorry. Was that for me?
Yes, Gupta, please.
No.
Yeah.
Yes, my view is I think there will be a pull-aside meeting, but that will be just more like a formality to getting to know you once again kind of meeting between President Xi and President Trump to keep relations on something of an even keel so that the negotiations can proceed thereafter in the months thereafter.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.